Coaching requirements. All coaches every year must go through the nfhs courses, the concussion course, heat acclimatization course, sudden cardiac arrest course. New for the 2019-20 school year is protecting students from abuse course. All 4 of those courses can be found at nfhslearn.com. Every coach in your program, from volunteer to paid, must go through that course each year prior to coaching in a practice or contest. As a reminder, all coaches must be CPR and AED certified. This must be done every 2 years. Your certification for both CPR and AED is a 2-year certification. So please check with your athletic director or your certification cards to see if you're due for a new certification for this school year. Sportsmanship. League office, we continue to see issues with sportsmanship by players and by coaches. We want to take some time this year in our rules presentation to put some questions to you coaches to get you to think about some things as it pertains to your team and your behavior for sportsmanship. One of the first things we want you to think about is, how often do you discuss this with your team? Do you make sportsmanship a priority? Do you take time each day to go through with your athletes your expectations, how you want them to handle adverse situations? Or do you put it on the back burner and let it become a reaction when it happens? If you put it on the back burner and let it become a reaction when it happens, you know there's a high chance that the result is not going to be what you expect. Understand too, we're working with teenage athletes. No matter how much you go over something and how clearly you set your expectations, you're still going to run into a situation where a kid's going to make a poor decision. What we don't want is one kid's poor decision to lead into multiple kids' poor decisions and have multiple kids ejected from a contest due to one incident. We continue to see an increase in team displays of poor sportsmanship throughout the year. One kid making a mistake is one thing. Multiple kids making the same bad decision at the same time escalates the situation tremendously. Take time, discuss this with your team, set your expectations, let them know what will and will not be tolerated. 2 other questions we want you to think about is, if your team doesn't win, and obviously everybody wants to be a winner, and everybody wants to win every time you step foot on the competition field or court. But if you're not to win, or if you are to win, how do you want people to remember your teams? When the game's over, during the season, when you leave the sporting event, years to come, how do you want people to remember your teams? Obviously, everybody wants them to remember their teams as playing hard, consistently playing hard, giving it their all. All the coach speak you can throw out. But what is it about their character you want people to remember? No matter how difficult the situation was, they held their heads high and handled it well? Or do you want people to remember that whenever something went wrong or whenever there was a chance, they showed poor displays of character and poor displays of sportsmanship? You set the tone. You're the leader. You lead them in drills. You lead them in team activities. You lead them through contests. You also lead them down the correct path of sportsmanship. Take time to speak to your team about sportsmanship daily. Make this part of what you do. Make this part of your culture and your expectations. And remember, sports, they don't build character, they reveal it. What character will you and or your players reveal when times get tough? What character will you reveal when things are going your way? It's all part of the educational-based athletics process. Teaching skills, winning, developing the athlete, developing the person. Sportsmanship falls under the latter, developing the person. This is something they can carry with them as they go through life. Make it a priority each day to set your expectations on sportsmanship. Okay, athlete ejections. If you have an athlete ejected, remember, they can remain in the bench area during the contest. This becomes a supervision issue. If you ever have an official or someone that tells you your athlete has been ejected, they must leave the facility, they must leave the venue, that is not correct. Athletes are allowed to stay in the bench area if they've been ejected. They cannot return to play, but they can stay in the bench area provided they do not become a hindrance in the remainder of the contest. Also remember, any athlete ejected from a contest becomes immediately ineligible. They will remain ineligible to compete until they've been cleared by the league office. And cleared means serving their suspension. Failure to do so will result in you playing an ineligible athlete. Some changes this year to length of suspensions. Football, swim, lacrosse, and cheer will remain at 1, as it has been for many years. Golf, volleyball, and wrestling, because they use play dates and not number of contests, will remain at 2. New this year is a 3-game suspension. This is the minimum. We've increased the number of games allowed in these sports. Therefore, we feel like the percentage needs to go up. The executive committee changed this past May. The sports of basketball, baseball, softball, tennis, and soccer. An ejected athlete will carry a minimum 3-game suspension during the regular season. These minimums, the 1, 2, and 3 games for the sports, are during the regular season. If you look down at the bottom, playoffs have been changed to where an ejection in the playoffs carries a minimum next game suspension. So your minimums of 1 game, 2 games, and 3 games in the respective sports are for the regular season. Should you get ejected in the playoffs, all sports fall under a minimum next game. Understand, these games are set at the minimum. If you are ejected and it is a severe ejection, you're not going to get the minimum. If your ejection is a minor ejection or a routine ejection, chances are it's going to be set at the minimum. I can tell you, coaches, to share with your athletes, disrespectfully addressing a game official is not going to get you the minimum. Disrespectfully addressing a game official is going to exceed the minimum. So if you're in the sport of basketball, baseball, softball, tennis, or soccer, and you disrespect a game official, you're going to get more than 3 games. In golf, volleyball, and wrestling, you're going to get more than 2 dates. In football, swim, lacrosse, and cheer, you're going to get more than 1, because those are minimum. Reminder, the ejections are served at the level the ejection occurs. If you're ejected from a sub-varsity contest, you must sit the number of games you're suspended for at the sub-varsity level. And a second ejection in the same sport will equal a 2-week suspension. Remember, that can carry a huge punishment, especially if you've got a basketball team that over 2 weeks has got 7 games scheduled. You're going to miss 7 contests because that's the minimum, is 2 weeks for your second ejection in basketball. Okay, ejection of coaches. Unlike players, coaches, if you get ejected, you must leave the facility or the stadium immediately, and you cannot return. A number of issues in the last few years where coaches have been ejected, and they weren't quite sure they had to leave the facility or stadium. We want to make it clear, if you're ejected, you must leave the facility or stadium immediately and not return. No questions asked. Whether you agree with the ejection or you disagree with the ejection. If you're ejected, leave. The best thing you can do as a coach when you've been ejected is to stop arguing, stop questioning it, accept it, and move on. In many cases, the minimums for coach ejections and the fine and the suspension are increased once the coach becomes ejected. You can do yourself a huge favor by leaving at that point in time. Remember, as a coach, too, you cannot return to coach at any level until cleared by the league. If you're in a tournament, first game's on a Friday at 8 o'clock at night, and you get ejected, you don't get to go back out there Saturday and just start coaching because you haven't heard from the league office. If you haven't heard from us, that means you haven't been cleared. And we will not be communicating this with you. We'll be communicating with your AD or principal. So if they've not heard from us, then you're not cleared. And you assume that they haven't heard that you keep sitting out. Changes this year to coach ejections. Executive committee approved in April. The coach ejection will now carry a minimum 2-game suspension, and the fine will remain at $300. In the past, the minimum ejection for coaches has been 1-game suspension and $300 fine. The minimum game suspension for coaches is increased to 2, and the fine will remain at $300. And remember, that fine goes to the school. The school decides they want to make you pay them for it. That's between you and your administration at your school. Now, that being a 2-game suspension, this is going to be crucial for you because, remember, the suspensions of a coach must be served at the same level where the ejection occurs. If you're a varsity level head coach or assistant coach and you're ejected from a sub-varsity game, you're going to be fined $300 and you're going to be suspended from the next 2 sub-varsity games. What that means is you will not be able to coach in any contest until you have served a 2-game suspension at the sub-varsity level. For example, you're helping your assistant coach out on a Thursday night, or your JV coach out on a Thursday night. You get ejected from the Thursday night JV contest. Your varsity team plays on Friday. Your varsity team plays Saturday. Your varsity team plays Monday. You won't coach in any of those games. Your JV team plays again on Tuesday. That'll be your first game suspension at the JV level. You will have missed the Friday, the Saturday, and the Monday varsity games. You sit the JV game. Your JV plays again on Thursday. You sit again. And then your varsity team plays on Friday. Now you're eligible to coach because you've served your suspension at the level where it occurs. So you got a 2-game suspension at the level it occurred, but you are ineligible to coach in any other contest between there. So essentially, because you were ejected from a sub-varsity game, and because the way your schedule worked out, you actually missed 5 contests total. Be mindful of that moving forward. There's no reason why varsity coaches should be ever ejected from a sub-varsity game. There's no reason why you should be ejected from a varsity contest. But if you are going to get ejected, understand the consequences of that ejection. And remember, if you're ejected from the final game of the season, the penalty is a minimum $500 fine. Okay, some reminders on ejections. The athlete's actions can get them suspended for up to 365 days. Rules and regulations do not allow any suspension to exceed 365 days. Obviously, 365 days suspension are reserved for severe actions of athlete or athletes or coaches. Rules and regulations also call for any athlete that is suspended for 365 days will result in the program being put on immediate probation, which will take you out of the playoffs immediately. Any athlete that leaves the bench during an altercation, they're going to get ejected from the contest, and that's going to result in a suspension. If they leave the bench during the altercation and they become involved by putting their hands on someone, even if it's in a goodwill gesture to remove them from the activity on the floor, if they put their hands on someone from the other team, grab them around the waist, pull them back, shove, punch, they're going to be ejected for multiple games depending on the level of their involvement. As we spoke about in the previous slide, disrespectfully addressing a game official is going to result in beyond the minimum for suspension. Physical contact with a game official is going to be an ejection and up to 365 days, depending on the severity of that contact. I can tell you more often than not, that is going to err more towards a 365-day suspension. The best thing you can do as a coach for your student athletes is to video every contest start to finish. Wide angle camera lens so everything can be seen. Instruct your camera operators to keep the camera running during any altercation. The important part of that is, yes, the ones that are guilty are going to be viewed. We're going to know who's guilty. But the most important thing is those that are innocent are going to be able to be cleared. We want to clear the ones that were not involved. We want to clear the innocent. It also allows us to see the level to which the athlete or the coach was involved. Without video to review the severity of the actions, all we have is what is written up. In some cases, what is written up exceeds what the athlete actually did. In some cases, what is written up doesn't meet the actions of what the kid actually did. Video everything so that we can review it and make sure the appropriate suspension is handled down. Remember, sportsmanship's a choice. Your student athletes make it, your assistant coach make it, and you make it every day. Make it a priority to go through this. Make it a part of what you do daily. Okay, medical information. Reminder, the approved healthcare providers who can return a student athlete to play anytime it involves a concussion, those 5, they all must be licensed in South Carolina, an MD, a DO, an AT, a PA, and an MP. Any one of those 5 can return a student athlete to play during a contest when symptoms or signs of a concussion are thought to be there. In absence of one of those 5, student athlete sent off the field for a concussion-like symptom by an official, that student athlete will remain out for the remainder of the game. Other important medical information for you, just as a reminder, last year we went through and implemented the wet bulb globe thermometer. Please be mindful of that as we get started in the 2019 school year. This does not just apply to outdoor early year activities. This also could be an indoor activity for the early part of the season, of the school year, and also could be involved in the latter part of the school year when the temperatures begin to rise again. All athletes' physicals must be on file with your school, and the date for that physical to be valid is April 1st of 2019. Any physical dated prior to April 1 of 2019 will not be valid this year for your student athletes. Check with your AD to make sure you have an emergency action plan for your facility, and not only for your facility but for each sports season. In many cases, you may use the same stadium that another sport uses, but you may not have every access point open to get into that stadium for your sport that another sport would. So just check with your AD to make sure you have an emergency action plan. Make sure you're aware of it, and it's always a good idea to keep a copy with you in the event something were to happen and you're the only person there to be able to make a decision on how to get the emergency vehicles in. All right, tournaments. We've had an issue in the last couple of years with tournaments and a definition of what a tournament is. Just a couple of things to remind you of. All tournaments, invitationals, and jamborees, they must be sanctioned by our office. Once we get it sanctioned and approved for sanctioning, we post that on our website. If you're participating in a tournament, an invitational, or a jamboree, check our website to make sure that it's been approved as a sanctioned tournament. If you participate in a non-sanctioned event or host a non-sanctioned event, you are subject to penalties and or fines. Don't put yourself in position to get a penalty and or fine by participating in a non-sanctioned event. Any contest in the preseason must be in a tournament that is sanctioned. We've had to call a few schools this past school year and remind them that you cannot host a round-robin invitational in the preseason. If you're going to host an event during that preseason date period, it must be a tournament. That means it must be a series of contests in competition for a championship at which at least first and second place are decided by a final contest. So if you're going to host an event in the preseason, it must be a tournament, it must be sanctioned. And when you submit your application for sanctioning, you must submit your brackets as they are to be played so that we can approve that as an approved tournament. If you have any questions on that, please feel free to call our office, and we'll be glad to help guide you through the process to make sure you get it right. Okay, transfers or ineligible players. The responsibility of making sure that every athlete on your court or field is eligible falls on your principal and athletic director. But it's always a good idea for you to remember what a transfer is and what an ineligible player is so that you can get the information to your AD and not place someone in error. A good thing to do is the first day of tryouts or the first day of practice is to check with every person trying out for your team and just ask one simple question. Who was not at our school from the first day till the last day last year, and who was not at our feeder middle school from the first day until the last day of the previous year? Anyone who was not at your school day one through the final school day of the year before, or at your feeder middle day one through the last school day the year before, is considered a transfer. What that means, if they came in day two, enrolled in your school, and stayed till the end of the year, they are still by rule a transfer. If they came in the last week of school, they are a transfer. Do not ask them who was at our school last year. That could potentially put you in a position to play someone who is ineligible due to the transfer rule. Make sure you take time to ask that question. Pass that along to your AD as soon as possible. If you know you have an athlete who's participating in preseason workouts months ahead of your season, who was not at your school the entire year last year, or not at your feeder middle school the entire school year before, make your AD aware so that they can start the process of a transfer. And in the event they're ineligible due to the transfer rule, they still have time to look into any options that may exist for eligibility. If you wait till the last minute, you could put that athlete in potential of having to sit out an extended period of time waiting on eligibility. And remember, to be eligible, that transfer must meet one of the criteria for eligible transfers stated in our handbook. Just because someone's a transfer does not make them ineligible. If they meet one of the criteria that makes them an eligible transfer, then they will be eligible. That is up to your AD and principal to determine whether that eligibility exists. And reminders, if they're not eligible for any reason, they cannot participate in a scrimmage, jamboree, or contest. They can practice, but they cannot participate in a scrimmage, jamboree, or contest. Okay, the 75% rule. With the change of the sports season, opportunity to practice outside of your sports season with your school team, we've seen an increase in questions from coaches and schools as it pertains to the 75% rule. We've also seen some violations where coaches didn't truly understand the 75% rule. They had a thought of what they perceived it to be. We'll take a moment to go through the basics of the 75% rule. Reminder, the 75% rule only applies to when a coach from your school is associated with the outside team. This includes all school employees and volunteer coaches. So if they work at your school or they coach at your school, paid or unpaid, assistant or head, if they're coaching an outside team that has your players on it, your student athletes, the 75% rule will apply to that outside team. If you or one of your coaches or one of your employees coaches an outside team with players made up of other schools, from other schools, or from other states, 75% rule doesn't apply to you. 75% rule applies to outside teams with returning players who dressed for a varsity contest the previous season. If you're coaching an outside team that has players from your school on it, but not one of those players dressed for a varsity contest the previous year, then the 75% rule does not apply to you. It only applies when you're coaching an outside team, or when a coach from your school or an employee from your school is coaching an outside team that contains returning players who dressed for a varsity contest the previous season. The numbers that you're allowed to have on that team are listed in the rules and regulations. It's not 75% of your outside team roster. The numbers you're allowed to have of players who dressed for a varsity contest the previous season on your outside team is in the rules and regulations. So we'll continue with the 75% rule. Here are some examples. Example 1. Soccer is allowed 8 players on an outside team under the 75% rule. So if you go to the rules and regulations and you look at the number of players allowed per sport on an outside team, coached by a coach from your school, a volunteer coach from your school, an assistant coach from your school, or a school employee, in the sport of soccer, that outside team is allowed to have 8 players on that team who dressed for a varsity game during the previous season. So if you're coaching a soccer team as an outside team, and you have 7 returning players on that team who dressed for a varsity game at your school, and 11 players who are on the JV season and never dressed for a varsity game, that outside team will meet the 75% rule because you did not exceed 8 players on that outside team that dressed for your varsity team the previous year. Example 2. Basketball is allowed 3 players on an outside team under the 75% rule. The outside team, coached by a coach from your school or an employee from your school, has 4 players on it who dressed for a varsity game the previous year, and 7 players who never dressed for a varsity game. This would be a violation. The reason that's a violation is that basketball is only allowed 3 players on the outside team that dressed for a varsity contest the previous year. The outside team in this example had 4 players who dressed for the varsity game the previous year and were on the outside team. Therefore, it would be a violation. As always, if you have any questions as to the legality of your varsity team or your outside team, call our office prior to establishing your outside team. Okay, our final slide before we'll turn it over to your sport commissioner for the rule changes in the NFHS rule book is on open and closed season. A lot of questions on this past year, and seeing a lot of coaches who don't fully understand what they can and cannot do during this time. Remember, if it's an open season, during that open season, you have 20 days of practice. That 20 days is for your use, however you want to use it, however many hours you want to go, however many kids you want to have out there. The only requirement is you must make it open to all students, and it cannot be mandatory for any. If you want to have 200 kids come to your softball practice, great. You only have 20 days with it. During the open season, your school facilities can be used. I have a lot of coaches who aren't sure they can actually use their school facilities during the open season. The open season, 20 days of practice. You to use how you want. School facilities may be used. Open to all students and cannot be mandatory. And a reminder that football and lacrosse, you have pad exemptions during that 20 days, that you can actually use pads, and days where you cannot use pads. Make sure you pay attention to your sport-specific rule if you're in football or lacrosse as it pertains to pads. The closed season. During the closed period, a coach cannot work with any athletes that's on campus or off campus. The only exception to this would be if you're coaching an outside team that has no affiliation with your school. Students are not allowed to use school facilities on their own. Example of this, no open gyms. You can't unlock the gym and say, hey, I can't be in there, but you can go shoot. That's a violation of the closed season. Strength and conditioning activities are allowed. We get a lot of calls. Hey, can we lift weights? Can we run? Can we condition? Absolutely. You can lift weights and run and condition year-round. You just cannot teach sport-specific skills or training during a closed period. Reminder, June and July, they're open for practice. The only exception to that is the dead week around July 4th. And also in June and July, you have 10 dates for team competition in all sports. That wraps up the first part of your rules presentation. I want to wish you all best of luck this year. And as always, if you have any questions on anything we've covered here or any questions on anything that was not covered here, do not hesitate to call our office or have your athletic director call our office. Our number is 803-798-0120. Thank you.
2019-20 baseball rule changes. First, the only rule change you have this year is dealing with the designated hitter rule. Now you can project who your DH is going to be. You still have the National League straight 9, where 9 defensive players will all hit 1 through 9 in the order with no DH. Substitution rules that have always been in place will apply the same way. You also have your previous DH rule, which was your 10-man lineup, where you had 9 defensive players and a DH for one of those defensive players. So you had 10 players in the starting lineup. All your substitutions, including courtesy runners, will apply exactly the same as they always have. However, this year, you've got a third option for a lineup, which will include a projected DH. That can be for any defensive player in the starting lineup. You will list them as their position /DH. They will then hold 2 positions, which will be the defensive player when they're on defense, and they're the designated hitter when they're on offense. If you do use the projected DH, for example, you see here in the lineup card, Daniels, number 44, is listed as the first baseman /DH. What this means is that if you choose to substitute defensively for Daniels with Jackson, as you see in the lineup card here, Jackson would enter in as the first baseman. Daniels would come off the field defensively, but he would be able to retain the DH position and hit in the offensive slot of the 4-hole. So Jackson would come in, play defense at first base. Daniels, who was listed as the first baseman /DH, becomes the DH in the lineup. To do this, coaches and officials, it must be listed on the lineup card to start the game. You can't project the DH after the fact. If you list a straight 9-man lineup with no DH on the lineup, you do not have a DH at any point during the game. So make sure, if you're going to use the projected DH potentially, that you list who that will be on the original lineup at the exchange at home plate. When using the DH projected rule, the role of the DH will be terminated for the remainder of the game when any substitutes come in offensively for the DH. I've got some examples later to help you understand this, but you can make as many defensive substitutions for that player. For example, you list Charlie as your pitcher /DH. You can make 6 substitutions at pitcher with 6 different players off the bench, and Charlie would retain the DH slot in all 6 of those defensive changes. However, if you make any offensive changes for Charlie in that slot as the DH, you would lose the role of the DH for the remainder of the game. You would also lose any defensive subs that are in that slot as well. So an example of that would be Charlie is your pitcher DH. You bring in Mike in the 2nd inning to pitch. Charlie remains your DH. You decide to let John hit for Charlie in the 3rd inning. Your DH slot is lost. John now enters the game as the pitcher in the pitcher slot. You could obviously move him to any defensive slot you wanted to, but Mike, who was your pitcher at the time, will come out of the game. Charlie, as the DH, comes out of the game, and only Charlie, who was the original starter, could actually re-enter in that lineup spot. Again, I'll explain this a little bit later. Again, here's a slide that just reminds you that, again, an offensive substitution is going to terminate that DH role. This could either be as a runner, the pinch runner, or as a pinch hitter. Again, this rule changes the opportunity to have 3 different lineups. You've got the old 9-man straight, 9 defensive players all hit for themselves. You've got the 10-man lineup, the American League style, where you can DH for any defensive player. And now you have a 9-man lineup with one of those defensive players being projected as the DH. The rationale behind the rule change is the opportunity with pitch counts. If your pitcher is running up his pitch counts and you want to get him out of the game as a pitcher, yet you still want him to remain in the game because he is an offensive piece to your puzzle, or as a good hitter, you want him to continue to hit for whatever reason, but you're a little leery of putting him in the field to require him to make more throws on that night. This would give you an opportunity to do that. As I told you earlier, there's a catch to these rules, this new rule. The one is you make an offensive substitution, you're going to lose that DH slot or any defensive sub in that slot at the same time. The other catch to it is that if you use this predetermined pitcher slash DH, then a courtesy runner cannot be used for the pitcher in this lineup. This would also extend to the catcher slash DH. The reasoning behind it is, as a defensive player, they are the pitcher, but as an offensive player, they would be determined to be the DH. So they would be viewed as 2 different roles in this lineup. Defensively, they're the pitcher or the catcher. Offensively, they'd be viewed as the DH. So if you did use the projected lineup with a pitcher slash DH or a catcher slash DH, you would lose the opportunity to have a courtesy runner for them on offense. You could obviously always pinch run for them, but reminder, when you pinch run for them, you are killing the DH slot or any defensive subs in that slot as well. Here are some examples of what you can do if you've got this projected lineup. Smith would be listed as your second baseman DH on your lineup card at home plate when you hand it in. After 4 innings, you decide Smith's not getting it done defensively, or he's a liability to you out there defensively. So you bring in Jones to play defense, but Smith would remain in your offensive lineup as the DH. Second example is White is listed as a pitcher slash DH on the lineup card. After 2 1/3 inning, you make a pitching change. Jones comes in to pitch. White would then remain in the game as a DH from the offensive end. Again, in that pitcher DH, White, as long as he's pitching, whenever he's DHing, he would not have an opportunity to have a courtesy runner. The third example is this would be a multiple sub situation, or moving that defensive player to another position. You have Williams, who's listed on the original lineup as the pitcher slash DH. After 4 innings at pitcher, you decide to bring Sullivan into pitch, but you send Williams to third base. In this case, Sullivan would actually enter the game as a sub for Thompson, who was your original third baseman. After 5th inning and 2 errors at third by Williams, you decide to put Stone in at third base. Williams would now come out of the defensive lineup, but would remain in the offensive lineup as the DH because he was originally listed as a defensive position slash DH. Here are a few examples of when you're going to lose that DH by making a sub. White's listed as a pitcher DH on the lineup card. After 2 1/3 innings pitched, you make a pitching change. Jones comes in to pitch, and White comes out of the game altogether. Jones now hits in White's spot. White could re-enter, but not as the DH. The DH is done. So in this case, you're making a complete position change, in the lineup. You're going to enter in Jones completely for White and not allow White to hit. So Jones comes in, White comes out of the game altogether. You're tired of watching him strike out. You're tired of watching him get hit around the field. You bring in Jones completely for the position. Jones is going to hit in that spot, but you lose the DH spot down the line. Jones will now have to hit for himself as the sub. White, as the starter, could always re-enter into that slot in the lineup, but not just as the DH. Another example, and probably one that you're going to need to pay attention to late in ball games. You got Jones as the pitcher DH on your original lineup when you hand it in. After 4 1/3 innings, you make a pitching change. Smith comes in to pitch, and you leave Jones in at DH. To lead off the 6th, Jones hits a double. You decide to pinch run Perry for Jones. That is an offensive substitution. When you do that, he's going to come into that spot in the order for both Jones and Smith, who's still pitching. So you're going to lose Smith pitching and Jones in that slot as the DH. You're also going to lose the DH slot. Jones could always re-enter as the starter in that. Another example of how you could lose this DH position. Green's listed in the lineup as the right field DH. In his first 2 at-bats, he strikes out. In the 5th, you decide to enter Holland in to hit for Green, and he'll play defense in right. Holland would now occupy Green's spot in the batting order in this position in right field. The DH would be dead. If Holland were to come out of the game, he is out of the game because he was a sub. Green could re-enter as a starter in that slot defensively and offensively. Points of emphasis for this year. Again, a courtesy runner can never have any function with a designated hitter. That would be in your current 10-man lineup that you've had for years, but also if you use them as a projected DH with either the catcher or the pitcher, you do not have the courtesy runner as an option. I think for the 3rd or 4th straight year, the slide rule has become a point of emphasis. A reminder, they're never required to slide, but if they do elect to slide any base, it must be a legal slide. Remember, that legal slide can be feet or head first. To be legal, runners cannot pop up into the fielder. See here, the runner sliding into the base, pops up into the fielder. That is an illegal slide. Another example of an illegal slide would be the runner having their leg raised higher than the fielder's knee. The foot's up, you see there above the fielder's knee. No contact, however, that is an illegal slide. That foot's got to be down. Remember, one leg and one buttock needs to be on the ground. The other one needs to be lower than the fielder's knee. Remember, except for at home, the runner cannot slide through the base and must be able to remain in contact with the base and be on the base to complete the legal slide. Runners cannot slide away from the base in an effort to make contact with the fielder or in the direction of the fielder, whether they make contact or not. They can slide away from the base. In this example, you see the fielder's on the outside of the base. The runner could slide to the inside to avoid any contact with the fielder or altering his play. That would be legal. Once he slides in the direction of the fielder away from the base, the slide becomes illegal. In the case of an illegal slide, the runner is going to be declared out. On a forced play, the runner is also going to be guilty of interference. This will result in the batter runner also being declared out, and the other runners will turn to their original bases they occupied at the time of the pitch. So bases loaded, ground ball in the middle of the infield, the runner on first has an illegal slide at second. He's going to be declared out. The batter runner is going to be declared out, and the original runners who were at second and third will be returned back to their original bases at the time of the pitch if there's only 2 outs at the end of this play. If the result of the 2 outs due to the legal slide and or interference results in the 3rd out of the inning would be over. Okay, beginning January 1, 2020, the baseball must be compliant by having the NOXI stamp on it. You must have the Federation stamp as well as the NOXI stamp on there. This has been coming for several years now. We've gone over this at every rules meeting the last few years. This was supposed to take place January 1 of 2019. However, due to manufacturer's request, it was delayed to 2020. Every ball at every level must have the NOXI stamp. If you've got 20 dozen baseballs that do not have the NOXI stamp, then you have 20 dozen brand new practice balls now. Chest protectors for catchers must be compliant. This is not entire gear, but you better make sure the chest protector for the catcher meets NOXI standards. And that is effective January 1, 2020. This has also been coming for a number of years as well. Okay, the popularity of these attachments to the helmets that many players are now wearing. To be legal, this must be, if it's attached after manufacture, it must meet the procedure and is approved by the manufacturer and meets NOXI standards at the time of manufacture. So the biggest thing is that these pieces were intended to go on the helmet, and the manufacturer has approved this being added after the fact to meet NOXI standards. Reminder, the pitching positions, the windup is one of two legal positions. The stretch is obviously the other. The non-pivot foot shall be in a position on or behind a line extended to the front edge of the pitcher's plate. You see the pitcher's plate there in front. The non-pivot foot must be on or behind that line. That is any part of their foot. If you have a pitcher who has been taught to pitch in the hybrid position, they need to back that non-pivot foot heel up to be in compliant with being in the front, in line with the front of the rubber. They can still step forward, they can step sideways, backwards, but they must start with that non-pivot foot on or behind the front of the rubber. In the set position, the non-pivot foot should be in front of a line extended to the front edge of the pitcher's plate, and this pivot foot should be in contact with or directly in front of and parallel to the pitcher's plate. And again, the rule change last year, you do not have to have your entire pivot foot in contact with the pitcher's plate. This allows for the variance in mounds, the holes that become on the rubber. So you just have to have some part of your foot in contact with the pitcher's plate. Here's an example of the hybrid position. You're not in the stretch or the wind up. You see the pivot foot is not parallel to the rubber, which would signify you're in the wind up. However, your non-pivot foot is not in line with the front edge of the rubber. I just drew a red line there for you to see. This non-pivot foot heel would need to back up to be at least at the red line, if not further back, to be in compliant. This young man who pitches in this position would need to bring his non-pivot foot heel back to this red line right here to become compliant. Otherwise, it would be an illegal pitching position. You'll have an illegal pitch. Emphasis of jewelry. Remember, it's not legal by rule to wear any jewelry. Coaches, you set this standard every day at practice. If you do not allow them to wear it at practice, the chances of them trying to wear it at a game will greatly decrease. When you go to the home plate meeting and you say that everyone is legally and properly equipped, you're verifying that no one's wearing jewelry. An umpire may warn your team to remove all jewelry after the fact. Go ahead and clean up for the game. Tell them don't wear it. It becomes a safety risk to them and to other players by wearing it. I want to thank you all for your time. Wish you best of luck this baseball season. If you have any questions, feel free to call our office.